there's really no way to know what mine that salt came from,
Correct,
how it
yes.
was extracted, how it was processed, how many hands it changed through. Did they wash it with some chemical?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Carnivore Done Right. Our guest today is Darryl Bosshardt. Now, Darryl is passionate about healthy living, healthy eating, and lifelong learning. Darryl grew up working for the family mineral business in Redmond, Utah, and then earned a Bachelor of Science degree at Southern Utah University, followed by an MBA at Western Governors University. That said, Darryl, tell me, how did the real salt get started?
Hey, that's a great question. I'm glad you had me on your program today. So, back in the about 1950s, my grandfather and his brother had a farm in central Utah.
Okay.
And just north and just south of that farm, there was an outcropping of salt that the Native Americans had harvested here in central Utah long before any of the Western settling pioneers came into the valley.
Okay.
So they knew there was salt under the farm. And there was a really bad drought in the late 1950s, and the farm wasn't doing that well. So they figured, hey, we've got salt north and south of us. There's probably salt under the farm. And so they got a loan and got a bulldozer and plowed out the alfalfa out of the way
Oh,
and
wow.
then accessed this beautiful crystal salt. And at the time, they didn't really know what they had. I mean, they knew
Mm-hmm.
it was salt, and we here in Utah, we have a lot of storms in the winter, and so we were selling it primarily to melt snow on roads,
Okay.
and then also to the local farmers. And the local farmers noticed that their cows loved this mineral natural salt that was here in this spot in Utah, loved it way more than the other salts that they had on the farm. And so the cows loved it, and the roads loved it. And because that's the salt we had, we used it as a family as well for our food salt.
For sure.
But it really didn't become real salt and the food salt great product that you know today until the 1970s. In the 70s, the health food movement really started to take off. And there was a nutritionist from New York that was passing through the area. He had stopped at the Grand Canyon or something. And when he got back to New York, he wrote an article about the best, healthiest, tastiest salt in America is this salt out of central Utah.
Oh, wow.
And we started getting these phone calls from folks back east wanting to buy this salt. And we
Mm-hmm.
weren't even selling it as food salt at the time. And so the family sat around and said, hey, we probably ought to put this in a shaker and sell it to the health food stores, if nothing else. And they sat around and said, what do we call this stuff? It's not, fake salt. It's not processed salt. It's just real salt.
Oh,
And the
for
name
sure.
stuck. And then we fast forward, and that's kind of how real salt was born.
Oh, wow. That's all. So everything pretty much just started in the pretty much early 70s, you'd say?
For the food side, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The family and the locals had used it, and even back in the 1300 AD,
Mm-hmm.
the local population was using the salt, but it wasn't until the 1970s health food movement that really kind of moved real salt forward to where it is today.
Okay. Oh, wow. That's pretty awesome. So it's been actually used for many years, almost more than 100 couple years, right? So it's which is amazing to actually have
Yeah,
that.
yeah. If you're ever here in Utah, there's a couple of really neat places, some national museums and
Mm-hmm.
monuments. It's called Mesa Verde. It's actually in New Mexico, and they actually have salt from this deposit that the early native cultures had mined and then traveled clear into Mexico with. So
Okay. Oh, wow.
it has a beautiful history long before my family got involved.
That's pretty awesome. And yourself now, how long have you been involved with the real salt with the Redmond company? And I know it is a family owned, but when did you actually get into it yourself?
Yeah, so I grew up around the mine. I grew up in the mine with my family, but
Mm-hmm.
I didn't start full time until 2005.
2005. Okay, that's awesome. So tell me, Daryl, what's the differences in, like, say, sea salt and other salts like the pink, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. Salt today, regardless of where it comes from, is
Mm-hmm.
can be defined as sea salt because at some point all salt comes from the ocean, right? It might be the Dead Sea, like the Dead Sea in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a Dead Sea like the Great Salt Lake here in Utah.
Okay.
It might be a current ocean like the San Francisco Bay or the Gulf of Mexico, or it might be an ancient seabed, a seabed that was laid down eons ago. And in the case of the Himalayan salt that comes out of Pakistan, or the Bolivian salt, which is another great ancient native salt from Bolivia, or the real salt from here in Utah, all of those are ancient native seas.
Okay.
And so whether you buy a sea salt from the current ocean, the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico,
Yeah.
you buy a Dead Sea salt like the Dead Sea in Israel or the Great Salt Lake, or an ancient sea salt like that comes in the Himalayan deposit or the Utah deposit or the Bolivian deposit, the sea is consistent among all of those. It's just a matter of how that is extracted today. And so there's a lot of confusion in that. If we went back into the 70s, and even today I'll go speak at colleges and I'll ask people, hey, raise your hand if you think sea salt is better.
For sure.
And inevitably, almost everybody raises their hand. And if you look at the label on a lot of these sea salts, unfortunately, the sea salts that have the label sea salt, even though people think it's a more natural or a healthier product, still has a slew of additives, or they've gone through and they've extracted other minerals out,
Okay.
Which changes the nature of that sea salt. So when I visit with people, I'd say, don't look for sea salt, look for natural salt, and then ask a few questions. Now, the reason that's important is our oceans today don't occur as pure sodium and chloride.
Okay.
In the ocean, you have potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride. It's a complex chloride. And the Dead Sea and the Great Salt Lake here in Utah is the same thing. They're not, it's not pure sodium and chloride. Our bodies, as you know, sodium is really important for our bodies, but so is potassium, magnesium, calcium. In the body, we have the sodium-potassium pump, and it requires potassium to open that pump up, right? So potassium and sodium work together. And so if you go through salt and you take out the potassium and sell it off to a vitamin company, or you extract the magnesium and you sell that off, and now you've got this pure sodium and chloride left, and then because salt is hygroscopic, meaning salt absorbs moisture out of the air, and if you add chemicals to the salt to make it stop retaining moisture, well, then you're going to have problems with that product, because your body, instead of having this naturalistic, thing that nature created, now we've got this chemical that's been processed, similar to, ascorbic acid is part of vitamin C, but pure ascorbic acid tablets interacts in the body a lot differently than an orange that has all those other flavonoids and biochemistry that's going on in addition to the ascorbic acid. And salt's the same way.
So what it looks like is happening is a lot of manufacturers, a lot of companies, they're taking the complex of the Himalayan salt, for example, and like you're saying, so they break it apart and they start to sell off the potassium, magnesium, sodium, so on and so forth, even possibly separating some calcium, and that kind of breaks the complexity of the salt. Therefore, when you take it, no wonder why, some articles will say, well, hey, if you do consume high salt or high this or high that, your electrolytes will become unbalanced, you'll have high blood pressure, so forth and so on, right?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that happening with the Himalayan specifically, but I know it happens in a lot of the liquid deposits in the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico. They'll use different liners in the evaporation ponds to extract those other key elements.
Okay.
And I think a combination of those other elements that are extracted and then the anti-caking agents that are added, one of the things about salt is it helps the body balance and regulate fluids,
for sure,
both intercellular and extracellular. That's the job of salt. And because of that, salt interacts with moisture. So if you and I were in Florida today and it was really humid and we put one of the salt crystals on a coffee table, that will actually suck moisture out of the air because it's so hygroscopic. It's actually dehumidifying, which is why it works great in meat lockers, because it cures the meat. It's why it works great on fish to suck the blood and the juices out of the fish and kind of cure it because of that. Well, when you take salt like that and then you add things like calcium silicoaluminate or sodium ferrocyanide or yellow prussiate of soda, these chemicals that repel moisture, and then you mix that with the salt, and then you consume the salt, and then we wonder why our body struggles with fluids when we're eating salt that's got a chemical that's supposed to stop the interactions of moisture. So really, getting back to that natural product that, for thousands of years, salt sustained life. It was used as a source of trade. It was essential for life. And then today, if you go to the hospital hospital, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to start an IV of saline solution, which is
Correct.
salt water.
Yeah.
So if salt were the bad thing that we've sometimes been led to believe, we wouldn't get it intravenously in every hospital in the world.
Oh, no kidding, for sure. Now, in certain countries, Redmond salt might not be available. I know I have some client overseas as well too. That sometimes they can't find it. Now, that said, what should our audience look for, and what questions should they ask when they're trying to find a natural source of salt?
That is a great question. And obviously, I'm a little biased because, of the history here. And if you taste them side by side, I think Redmond has an amazing flavor.
Yes.
The real salt is just, I think quality-wise hard to beat. But great question. So if I'm in South America and I'm in a spot where, we don't have real salt readily available, and with food miles, if you've got a great natural salt in Bolivia, outside of, the capitalistic leaning, say, I'd like to sell you some salt, it really makes more sense to find a great salt in Bolivia if you've got that choice.
For sure.
And so the three questions that I like to ask people is first, know the source, know where it's coming from. Because one of the challenges with a lot of salt today, if you go to a big box store up, you go to Loblaws or something in Canada and you go to buy a shaker of salt, and you buy a shaker that's gray or that has pink salt in it or that's even white salt or sea salt, you really don't have any idea where that salt came from. What body of water did it come out of? Unfortunately, us humans haven't been the best stewards of the environment. With Exxon Valdez, with the BP oil spill, it's unfortunate, but our oceans today, let alone the toxic waste, the sewage, the garbage, the radiation, our oceans aren't as clean as they used to be. And so when you pick up a shaker of salt, and these three questions, I think your listeners would apply those same if they're having a nice prosciutto with getting some salmon, or they're having, steak or whatever they're eating. I think these questions are important. So where is it coming from? Who's producing it? I think that really makes a big difference today.
Okay.
Knowing the producer is, I think, important. So you can, talk to the farmer and say, hey, are you using antibiotics? Are you using steroids? If so, how long has the animal been off of those? I mean, those are, I think, important questions. And then the third one, are they adding things to it, or are they taking things away from it? If you were to go buy a great, maybe an orange isn't a great example for the carnivore diet, but if you were to eat an orange buy an orange, and that orange had all of the vitamin C sucked out of that orange, why would you still want to buy the orange? Because the citrus in the orange is the value of the orange. Same thing if you were eating liver. Liver's a great organ meat, tons of great nutrition. But if somebody had gone through and pulled out the enzymes and pulled out the iron and pulled out, and then added other stuff back to it, fortified vitamins to put back in it, I think those are things that a consumer should want to know. So if you can find the source and you know who's producing it and what they're doing to it, I think those are the three questions. And I think if you ask those and you lived in, Bolivia, you would find a great salt. There's a beautiful pink salt in Bolivia. And if you live in the Middle East, you could ask those same questions and you could probably find a great Himalayan version that's there. I think one of the challenges with the Himalayan deposit isn't that the salt itself is a problem, but there's so many producers of it and it all comes out and hits the open market. And so by the time it hits Canada or the US, there's really no way to know what mine that salt came from, how it's extracted, how it was processed, how many hands it changed through. Did they wash it with some chemical? Did they use labor that we feel would be the equitable thing to do? I think those are the challenges with some of the foreign products. Not that they're necessarily bad. And if you can find the answers to those three questions, I think wherever you are, you'll get great food in your diet, be it, bacon, be it whatever that is.
Oh no, 100%. So definitely every audience out there, wherever they live around the world, they should definitely kind of research it, do their diligence where they actually ask these specific questions like you mentioned, especially finding out the source, the manufacturer, and or if there's anything being pulled and or added to it as well too, which is very, very important, just to make sure they are getting the proper minerals from that salt.
Exactly.
Now, I know maybe we did cover some of the info on this question here that we got. Now, going through some medical research and articles, now they claim that salt is considered as being bad for us. Should we try to eliminate from our diet?
I don't think so. If we go back before about in the late 1800s,
Hmm.
the refrigerator was invented. I think around 1847 or
Yeah,
57, the refrigerator's invented. Before the refrigerator was invented, all of us, you, me, your audience, all of us would have eaten more salt because all of our food would have been preserved in salt.
correct.
This time of year in Utah, it is cold and it is snowy. Maybe that's the way in Calgary it is right now too. But you don't have a lot of great food options this
Hmm.
time of year without access to mass transportation and food preservation. And so because of that, back in the 1800s, you and I both would have eaten more salt, maybe not now because you're already of your current lifestyle, but most Americans at least
Yes.
would be eating more salt because, jerky would have been preserved with salt, sauerkrauts, kimchi's, any vegetables that were preserved or fish would have been preserved with salt. And yet we didn't have this problem with water retention and blood pressure and these other issues, in the late 1800s. There's a lot of dietary things that have changed and environmental things that have changed in that time.
For sure.
But it's not the salt itself that's the problem. It's that the nature of salt
Hmm.
changed and all of the other junk that people usually associate with salt.
Yes.
It's the foods that are salty that are the problem, not the salt itself, if the salt is the way nature created it, without all the chemicals and other stuff added to the salt. Which is why, when you sweat, and I don't recommend you do this, but when you sweat, if you lick
Hmm. It's very
your arm is
salty.
salty. If you're crying and you taste your tears is salty. And I wouldn't recommend this for sure, but if you tasted your urine, believe me, it's going to be salty.
Oh,
And so no matter how much water you drink, when we sweat, when we cry, when we urinate, all of these body processes require salt. And so the first thing that happens generally when someone goes on a low salt diet, and you mentioned this with some of your clients before we start recording,
yes.
that a lot of people struggle with indigestion and bad assimilation.
Correct.
And that's particularly true when you go on a low salt because our body digests using things like hydrochloric acid and electrolysis
Yes.
and then some muscle contractions to mush that all together. But your body doesn't store hydrochloric acid. It makes it with hydrogen and with chlorine from the salt. And then the sodium potassium pump requires the sodium. So when you cut salt from your diet, I mean, worst case scenario, hyponatremia sets in and you die from low salt,
Yes.
which happens if you're working out, running, sweating, drinking water without the electrolytes. And so I think that's the part that people miss
Hmm.
is they hear salt's bad, but they're only hearing part of that story and not thinking through, is it the salt that's bad or is it the junk food that has the salt on it with this processed salt that's really causing the problem?
And that's the thing. I think we need, more knowledgeable people like yourself, where we get the word out there and we talk about, is it the salt itself, or is it how it's actually been taken and it's been abused, let's just say, with other foods and chemicals and ingredients, and assume, automatically we get articles where they assume salt is bad and salt is this, but technically it's what you guys have done to it or what's been done to it, right?
Exactly.
Now, usually our last question does come directly from the audience. Now, is how much should we consume per day for salt? And are there other products like real salt that Redmond has as well? Because I know
Yeah.
with with very limited places in across, like I know in Canada and overseas and in some Europe, possibly they don't have the full blown possibly products as Redmond would have on the website possibly. So what's your thoughts on that, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I don't have to give the recommendation because there's a lot
Okay.
of great books. There's a lot of great books on salt and nutrition. If we go back several years, one of my early favorite books on salt was a book called Your Body's Many Cries for Water, written by
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Batman Gelly.
Okay.
And then since then, there was one that was called Salt Your Way to Health.
Okay, yeah.
And there's been a few other really good ones since then. The Salt Fix, it was Dr. James D. Nicolantonio wrote a recent one. And a lot of these center on this idea that our bodies are made up of water. We're really saline solution in motion. So water, I mean, food's important, but water is such an important part of our body. And next to water, then salt is the next important thing. You know, salt, water, and oxygen are just so important. So when it comes to salt and water, the really important part, according to Dr. Batman-Gelly and Dr. David Brownstein, they would say that we need to be drinking about half your body weight in ounces.
Okay.
Is a good minimum. So I'm about 150 pounds, which means I should, according to them, drink about 75 ounces worth of water a day.
Okay.
Now, that's in addition to coffee, tea, whatever else I might be consuming, just 75 ounces of a good, clean water, not all at once, but throughout the day to stay hydrated.
For sure.
And they would say that adding a quarter teaspoon of salt to that per quart of water that you drink. So throughout the day, if I'm drinking 75 ounces, that's about a quart and a half or so, not quite a liter. And so with that, I ought to be adding about a quarter teaspoon and a half a quarter teaspoon to that water. Now I could add that to my food. I could put that in a glass of water and drink it. Soleil is something that a lot of people are talking about today, which is just salt at max salinity. Water can hold a maximum of 26% sodium and chloride.
Yes.
And so there's people that would they'll add a teaspoon of Soleil water, which is 25% salt, to a glass of water and drink it. So I think that's a great place to start, salting our food liberally and then adding a little bit of salt to your water. Now, something that I do at my house, we have coarse salt that is a little bit large, like a peppercorn. Yep. And I leave a dish on my table of that salt that's just always there. And my family, as we walk past, you know, if you start listening to your body knows when it's thirsty. And if you listen, your body knows when it needs salt as well. And so we just put a little dish of salt on the table. And as you walk past, you know, it's interesting. Sometimes I'll just grab a piece and the salt tastes really sweet. It's a really sweet flavor. And then as your salt level comes up, it becomes more and more salty, less sweet. And so that's one of the ways I do it. So I'll add salt to water. If I go out running, I'll take a big drink. I actually make my own kind of sports drink, and I'll take a quart of water, and I'll put a quarter teaspoon of salt in it. And then sometimes I'll mix in a little bit of honey or a squeeze of lemon if I want some flavor. But if you mix that up, quart of water with a quarter teaspoon of salt, that's the best sports drink you'll ever make. And it's going to be pennies on the dollar compared to the blue stuff with the food coloring and the sugar and everything else in it.
Oh, no kidding.
So that's what I would recommend as far as that goes. Now, Redmond, as I mentioned before, started in 1958, and we love products that are simple, clean, and real. So that was the basis of the idea of real salt when it started. And since then, we've added another fun line of products. There's a natural bentonite clay deposit right there, right next to our salt deposit. So we have a line of clay products that we do toothpaste and facials and just a lot of fun products with clay. And if you don't have them on your website, you can go to realsalt.com or redmond.life, redmond.life, which is kind of the parent company of the Real Salt brand. And then it has some of those other products listed there.
No, that's awesome. What I'll do is I'll definitely list the links below the video as well too, for the audience to click and check out the products you guys have and possibly educate themselves on a lot of different information about the salt as well too. And I'm glad you actually brought up in regards to making a drink, as almost like a pre-workout / for training, because we do have a lot of large audience who are actually into running, athletics, and bodybuilding as well too. And they always ask me, well, can we have like salt and maybe a little bit of possibly lemon or apple cider vinegar? And I'm glad you mentioned that, because definitely it will change how everybody kind of looks at it and how much they should actually be using as well.
Well, I go mountain biking a lot here in the summer times, and having a water bottle filled with water and a little bit of salt really cuts down on my leg cramps as I'm out there, as I replace those electrolytes as I'm sweating. And something, a lot of the keto carnivore, lifestyle also includes intermittent fasting. And so we actually have, I don't know if you've seen these before, but we've got, they're salt crystals in a bag. It's just a salt crystal. And if you are fasting, sucking on a salt crystal actually is quite, refreshing and a bit of an appetite suppressant. And so if you are feeling extra hungry as you're going through an intermittent fast or, between meals, actually sucking on a little salt and drinking water is a nice treat.
No, that is amazing, and I'm glad you brought that up because this would be definitely on my list and my audience's list, just because we tend to go through quite a bit of fasting, at least 3-4 times a week, and sometimes we do the full 72 hours once a month. So having something like that handy, whenever you feel that slight hunger or slight fatigueness, and just having that salt crystal will definitely benefit them as well too.
Yeah, the fasting is such a healing part of the body, but as it's doing that, it's also a very cleansing part of the body.
Mm-hmm.
And salt and water are essential for the body to help process and get rid of everything. It's such an important part of the metabolic process.
No, it is. Darryl, that was amazing. Thanks so much for your time. Really enjoyed it. And we'll hopefully down the road we can do even something a little more in depth on other products and invite you back in the show and go from there. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.